The classroom on Kepler 7 station hummed with the quiet energy of anticipation, and 47 different species filled the tiered seats that curved around the central teaching platform like an amphitheater designed by someone who understood that not all students had the same number of eyes or the same field of vision. Instructor Vrelanak stood at the center, her four arms moving in the graceful patterns that her species used to emphasize important points, and her scaled skin reflected the soft blue light from the viewing ports that showed the stars beyond. She had taught at the Galactic Coordination Academy for 300 years, which was a very long time by anyone's standards, except perhaps the crystalline Ven, who measured their lives in millennia. And she had seen thousands of students pass through her advanced problem resolution class. Most of them failed. That was not a criticism but simply a fact, because the Academy did not accept students who wanted easy answers or quick solutions. And every being in this room had already survived 2 years of preliminary training that had broken stronger candidates than them. Kai-Chun sat in the third row, his human frame looking almost comically average compared to the towering Kryn warrior on his left and a floating gas cloud entity on his right that communicated through color changes and smelled faintly of copper. He had been at the Academy for 6 months now, ever since Earth's diplomatic corps had selected him from a pool of 5,000 applicants, and he still felt like an imposter among beings whose civilizations had been exploring space for thousands of years. While humans had only made first contact 23 years ago, his species was new here, untested, and most of the other students treated him with polite curiosity, the way one might regard an exotic pet that had learned an amusing trick. Vrelnak's voice carried across the room, without need for amplification, her translator implant rendering her clicks and whistles into perfect galactic common. Today you begin your semester project, and I will tell you now that most of you will not complete it before the term ends. A ripple of movement passed through the students. The Cloran named Mixola wobbled nervously in their containment suit, and the Ven called Taler's crystalline facets caught the light as they shifted position. This is not a test of intelligence, Vrelanak continued, and 2 of her hands gestured to a floating cart that drifted beside her, but of patience, systematic analysis, and the understanding that some problems cannot be rushed. The cart held rows of identical boxes, each one roughly the size of a human head, made from a metal that seemed to shift between silver and bronze, depending on the angle of view. Kai leaned forward slightly, his surgeon's instincts making him observe details. No visible seams, no obvious buttons or switches, just smooth surfaces that caught and held the light in strange ways. These puzzle boxes, Vrelanak said, and her third arm lifted one to show the class, were created by the precursors, a species that vanished 100,000 years ago but left behind artifacts that we still struggle to understand. She rotated the box slowly, and Kai noticed a faint humming sound, like the vibration of a tuning fork held just out of hearing range. The fastest student in Academy history took 4 months to open one, the instructor continued, and her eyes, all 6 of them, scanned the room. And the average time is closer to 6 months, with many never succeeding at all. Tala raised one geometric appendage, their voice like wind chimes. What is inside, instructor? That is for you to discover, Vrelanak replied, and something in her tone suggested she was smiling, even though her species had no lips. But I will tell you this. Opening the box is not about finding a hidden switch or applying force. It is about understanding the pattern, the logic, the intention of the makers. She began distributing the boxes, floating the cart through the aisles while students reached out with hands, tentacles, fields of force, and other appendages that defied easy classification. Kai watched as Mixola received theirs, the gelatinous being immediately pressing their mass against the box's surface as if trying to sense its contents through touch alone. And Taller took theirs with mathematical precision, already producing scanning equipment from a storage pouch when Vrelenak's cart reached Kai's row. She paused, and her main eyes focused on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Human," she said, and her translator gave the word a neutral tone that could have meant anything. "Your species is young in the galactic community, and you have no experience with precursor technology." Kai nodded, unsure if she was warning him or simply stating facts. "Do not be discouraged if this takes you longer than others," Vrelanak continued, and she placed a box into his waiting hands. "Patience is a skill that can be learned." The box was heavier than it looked, and the metal was warm to the touch like something alive. And Kai felt that same instinct that had made him a good emergency surgeon. The urge to do something rather than just observe. He stood, intending to return to his seat and set up his workspace the way he'd seen other students doing. And as he walked, he turned the box over in his hands, feeling its weight distribution and noting how the humming changed pitch slightly when he rotated it. His fingers found what felt like a slight depression on one surface, and he pressed it while simultaneously twisting the opposite corner, because that's what his hands wanted to do. And there was a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet classroom. The box unfolded in his palms like a mechanical flower, its sections sliding apart with perfect precision to reveal a glowing core of amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Kai stopped walking. The entire classroom stopped. Everything. Conversations died mid-word. Equipment powered down, and even the floating gas entity froze in place. 46 pairs of eyes, or equivalent sensory organs, turned to stare at the human standing in the aisle with an open precursor puzzle box in his hands. And Kai looked down at it with an expression of genuine confusion. "Was it broken?" he asked, and his voice sounded very small in the sudden silence. Relen's forearms had frozen in mid-gesture, and her skin color had shifted to a pale blue that Kai's cultural briefing had taught him meant extreme shock or distress. The instructor moved toward him with a speed that seemed impossible for someone her size, and her 6 eyes were all fixed on the open box with an intensity that bordered on religious awe. She spoke in her native language, forgetting to use Galactic Common, and her translator implant caught up a moment later, rendering her words as impossible. Tala rose from their seat, their crystalline body refracting light in patterns that indicated severe cognitive dissonance. "The human has been here 17 seconds, and the box is open." Mixola wobbled over, their gelatinous form pressing against the containment suit's walls. "How did you do that?" Kai looked from face to face, or face equivalent, and realized that something significant had just happened. Though he couldn't understand what he began, then stopped because he genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence. "I was walking to my seat, and it felt like something wanted to move, so I moved it." Vrelanak reached out with one careful hand and took the open box from him, examining it as if it might be a fake or a trick. And her voice, when she spoke again, had lost all its teaching authority and become something quieter, almost frightened. "In 300 years of instruction, I have never seen this happen." The other students began to gather around, their own unopened boxes forgotten. And Kai stood at the center of their attention, feeling more lost than he had since arriving at the academy. He had come here to learn, to represent his species with dignity, to prove that humans deserved their place among the stars. Instead, he had apparently just broken every record in the school's history by solving a puzzle he didn't even know he was supposed to be solving. And from the way Vrelanak was looking at him with all 6 eyes wide and her skin color shifting through shades he couldn't identify, Kai suspected that his real education was only just beginning. The examination room was smaller than Kai had expected, and the walls were covered with sensors that tracked everything from his heart rate to the electrical patterns in his brain. And he sat in the center of it all, feeling like a laboratory specimen 3. Administrators had arrived within the hour after he'd opened the puzzle box, and they had brought with them Dr. Zenther, a cognitive specialist whose species resembled a collection of floating geometric shapes that constantly rearranged themselves into new configurations full. Nax stood against one wall with her forearms crossed in a posture that Kai had learned meant she was deeply troubled. And on the table before him sat 15 more puzzle boxes, all identical to the one he'd accidentally opened. "Explain again what you did," said Administrator Colvin, a being whose translator implant couldn't quite capture the harmonic overtones of his native speech. Kai sighed. And he'd already told this story 6 times. I picked up the box, I started walking. And while I was walking, I turned it over in my hands, because that's just what I do when I'm holding something. I like to feel how things are weighted and balanced. And then, prompted Dr. Zenther, their shapes spinning slowly, and then my fingers found this spot that felt slightly different. So I pressed it, and at the same time the opposite corner seemed like it wanted to twist. So I twisted it. Kai continued, trying to remember exactly what his hands had done. And it opened. Seemed like it wanted to twist, Tala repeated from their position near the door. And their voice carried an edge of frustration. "That is not a logical statement. Objects do not have wants." Kai shrugged. "I don't know how else to describe it." And it just felt right. Administrator Colvin gestured at the 15 boxes on the table. "We need you to try again. And this time, we will record everything, every movement, every pressure point, every angle of rotation." The next 2 hours were the strangest of Kai's life. And he picked up box after box while sensors tracked his every motion, and Dr. Zenther's geometric shapes hovered closer and closer to his head. The first box opened in 43 seconds. The second took 2 minutes and didn't open at all. The third opened almost immediately. The fourth, fifth, and sixth refused to open no matter what he tried. The seventh clicked open just as he was about to give up. By the time he'd attempted all 15, his hands were tired and his head hurt from concentration. And the results made no sense. 7 opened, 8 remained sealed. 47% success rate, Dr. Zenther announced. And their shapes formed what might have been an expression of confusion. And there is no consistent pattern in his movements. Vrelanak stepped forward, her skin color shifting to a thoughtful green. "Show us the recordings side by side, the successful attempts versus the failures." The room's main display lit up with multiple video feeds showing Kai's hands from different angles. And even Kai could see that his movements looked random, almost chaotic. "Wait," said Mixala, who had been watching quietly from their containment suit. "Look at his face during the successful attempts." The display zoomed in on Kai's expressions. And there it was, during every successful opening. His face showed a particular look of concentration that wasn't quite concentration. More like the expression of someone remembering a song they'd heard long ago. "He's not thinking," Vrelanak said slowly. And all her eyes widened. "He is feeling." Dr. Zenther's shape spun faster. "That makes no logical sense. And feelings cannot open mechanical locks. Can they not?" Vrelanak countered, and she picked up one of the unopened boxes. "Kai, do not think about what you are doing. And just hold this and tell me what you feel." Kai took the box reluctantly, and he closed his eyes because looking at it seemed to make his brain want to analyze. And instead he just felt the weight, the warmth, the subtle vibration. He paused, searching for words. "It's like there's a rhythm to it. And right now the rhythm is wrong. And if I could just..." His hands moved without conscious instruction, pressing and twisting and sliding. And the box stayed stubbornly closed. "The rhythm is wrong," he repeated, and he opened his eyes. This one doesn't want to open right now. Doesn't want to, Toller said flatly, and their crystalline structure flickered with what might have been anger. You are anthropomorphizing inanimate objects, but Dr. Zenther had gone very still. Their geometric shapes locking into a rigid configuration. Administrator, I need to run a brain scan on the human, and I need to do it now. 20 minutes later, Kai lay in a medical scanner while his brain activity played out on screens that meant nothing to him but seemed to excite Dr. Zenther greatly. Look at this, the doctor said, and their shapes pointed at swirling patterns of light. When he successfully opens a box, his visual cortex, motor cortex, and what humans call the default mode network all activate simultaneously. Explain for those of us who are not neurologists. Administrator Colvin requested. He's not solving the puzzle through logical analysis, Dr. Zenther said, and their tone carried something like wonder. He is pattern matching at a subconscious level, and his hands are responding to intuitive processing that never reaches his conscious awareness. Vrelanak leaned closer to the displays. You are saying he genuinely does not know how he does it? Correct, Dr. Zenther confirmed, and I have never seen anything like this in any species we have studied. And I need to examine human cognitive evolution immediately. The research that followed took 2 weeks, and Kai found himself the subject of intense scrutiny while scientists from a dozen species analyzed human history, human psychology, and human brain architecture. The findings, when they came, changed everything. Humans, it turned out, had evolved under circumstances that most galactic species would consider nightmarish. A planet with wildly fluctuating climate, ice ages that came and went with geological speed, predators that could kill in seconds, and prey that could run for days. While most species had evolved intelligence through specialization in stable environments, humans had developed their minds in chaos, and their brains had optimized for speed over perfection, for good enough answers over optimal solutions, for intuitive leaps over methodical analysis. Dr. Zenther presented the findings to the Academy's full faculty. Humans use what they call heuristics, mental shortcuts that trade accuracy for speed. And they possess an unusual tolerance for failure because in their evolutionary environment, a fast wrong answer that could be corrected was better than a slow right answer that came too late. So the human is guessing? Asked one professor, a being made entirely of crystallized thought. Not guessing, Dr. Zenther corrected. His subconscious is processing thousands of variables: visual input, tactile feedback, proprioceptive data, and arriving at solutions through pattern recognition, so rapid that his conscious mind never sees the work being done. Toller, who had attended the presentation despite not being faculty, spoke up. This cannot be a reliable method for problem solving, and it is too chaotic, too random. And yet, Vrelanak said quietly, it works. The Academy's Director General, an ancient being whose species name was unpronounceable by most vocal cords, made a decision. We will test this properly, and we will invite representatives from the 5 most cognitively advanced species in the galaxy, and we will see if this human ability is truly unique or simply an anomaly. The challenge was announced within days, and scientists, scholars, and problem solvers came from across known space to participate in what the media had started calling the Puzzle Summit. Kai tried to return to his normal classes, but found that impossible. Other students either avoided him or asked constant questions, and his instructors didn't seem to know how to teach someone who solved problems through methods they couldn't explain. On the night before the summit, he found 50 more puzzle boxes outside his quarters with a note from Amot Vrelanak written in careful galactic common. If this is real, prove it and document everything. He worked through the night, and by morning he'd opened 32 of the 50 boxes, and his hands were covered in small cuts from where his unconscious movements had been too forceful. But he had also begun to understand something about himself, about the way his mind worked when he didn't try to think. And when he walked into the summit hall the next day, he carried that understanding with him like armor against the doubt he saw in so many eyes. The real test was about to begin. The summit hall had been transformed into something between a laboratory and an arena, and hundreds of observers filled the viewing galleries while 5 workstations stood arranged in a pentagon. Around a central display platform, Kai took his position at one station, and around him were the beings that represented the pinnacle of their species, cognitive abilities. Taller for the mathematically perfect, then a Cloran empath named Seshari, who could sense patterns in probability itself. A Krell hive mind unit called Kindar that processed information through distributed consciousness, and Voronal, a Sesseth like Vrelanak but whose 300 years had been spent mastering temporal mathematics. The Director General's voice echoed through the hall. Before you are 20 artifacts recovered from various precursor sites across the galaxy, and some have never been opened, some have never been understood, and all represent challenges that have stumped our best minds for decades or even centuries. Kai looked at the collection spread before him. Boxes, yes, but also spheres, pyramids, rings, and shapes that hurt to look at directly because they seemed to occupy more dimensions than his eyes could process. You will have 8 hours, the Director General continued, and you may use any tools or methods available to you. And success is measured not by quantity, but by quality of understanding. A timer appeared on the central display, and the challenge began. Taller immediately deployed scanning equipment that painted the artifacts with beams of light across spectrums Kai couldn't see, and their crystalline body began to hum with calculation frequencies. Approached their station slowly, extending pseudopods to touch each artifact gently, and their gelatinous form shifted colors as they sensed the emotional resonances left by the precursor Sendar. Split into 7 smaller units that surrounded their workstation, and each unit focused on a different artifact while their shared consciousness processed all inputs simultaneously. It's something that made the air around their station shimmer, and Kai realized they were examining the artifacts through time itself, looking at what they had been and what they might become. And Kai picked up the nearest object, a silver cube covered in symbols that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them, and just held it. Dr. Zenther's voice came through the observation speakers. All competitors are being monitored, and their methods will be analyzed in real time to better understand different approaches to problem solving. The first hour passed in near silence, except for the hum of equipment and the occasional chime when someone made progress. And Taller was the first to achieve success. Opening a geometric puzzle through pure mathematical analysis, the Venn solution was beautiful in its precision. They had calculated the exact sequence of rotations needed based on the ratios between the artifact's dimensions, and the object had unfolded like origami following a predetermined pattern. The observers applauded, but Kai barely noticed because he was lost in the feeling of the cube in his hands. And it was like trying to hear a conversation through a wall. He could sense something there, but couldn't quite make it out. He set the cube down and picked up a ring instead. And this one felt more responsive, more ready, and his fingers found a series of nodes along its inner surface that seemed to pulse under his pulse. Touch without thinking about what he was doing. Kai pressed 3 nodes in quick succession while rotating the ring counterclockwise. And something inside it clicked, and the ring split into 3 interlocking bands that began to glow with soft green light. 2 hours gone, and he'd opened 1 artifact. Sari achieved their first success shortly after, having spent nearly 90 minutes in empathic communion with a crystallized sphere before discovering that it responded to emotional frequencies rather than physical manipulation when they projected. Feelings of curiosity and welcome. The sphere had simply opened itself. Kindar's distributed processing was showing impressive results, and their 7 units were making coordinated attacks on the most complex artifacts. And by the 3-hour mark, they had successfully accessed 4 different objects through what could only be described as brute force parallel processing. Now's temporal approach was slower but devastatingly effective, and they examined each artifact across multiple timelines simultaneously until they found the timeline where the object was already open. And then they simply encouraged that timeline to become reality. It looked like magic, but was actually physics that Kai couldn't begin to understand, and Kai kept picking things up, feeling them, setting them down when they felt wrong, trying again when something felt right. The 4th hour brought frustration. He'd opened 3 more artifacts, but had also broken 2 by trying approaches that his intuition had insisted would work. And now those artifacts sat in pieces on his workstation while arrow lights blinked accusingly. The human has destroyed precursor artifacts, someone in the observation gallery whispered. And the comment was picked up by the hall's audio system. Kai felt his face burn with embarrassment, but he forced himself to keep working because giving up wasn't in his nature, and besides, his broken attempts had taught him something about the limits of intuition. By hour 6, the scoreboard told the story. Taller. 3 artifacts successfully analyzed. 0 failures, Seshari. 2 artifacts opened through empathic sensing. 0 failures, Kindar. 4 artifacts accessed through distributed processing. 0 failures, Voronil. 2 artifacts understood through temporal analysis. 0 failures, Kai-chun. 6 artifacts opened, 2 destroyed. 4 set aside as feeling wrong. The human is in the lead by raw numbers, Dr. Xanther observed. But his failure rate is concerning, and he has destroyed irreplaceable precursor technology. Relinak, watching from the faculty observation deck, spoke softly to herself. But he's also the only one still trying new approaches, and the others have settled into their methods. The final 2 hours became a race, and Taller pushed their mathematical processing to its limits and successfully opened 2 more artifacts through increasingly complex calculation. Cinder split into even more units, becoming 14 separate consciousnesses that moved in perfect coordination. And they managed to access 3 additional objects. Sesri achieved 1 more empathic breakthrough, coaxing open a device that had been sealed for 80,000 years by projecting the emotional equivalent of a lullaby. Voronil completed 1 more temporal analysis, though the effort seemed to exhaust them visibly, and Kai, running on instinct and determination, and perhaps too much coffee from the human-compatible dispenser in the corner, picked up artifact after artifact, feeling for that sense of rightness. And when he found it, he moved with the kind of speed that came from years of emergency surgery, where hesitation meant death. When the timer reached 0, the final count was displayed. Kai-chun, 12 opened, 2 destroyed, 6 set aside. Kindar, 7 accessed, 0 failures. Taller, 5 solved, 0 failures. Seshari, 3 opened, 0 failures. Voronil, 3 understood, 0 failures. The hall erupted in debate before the Director General had even announced results, and some observers argued that Kai's destroyed artifacts should disqualify him, while others insisted that attempting 20 objects showed more ambition than carefully selecting only guaranteed successes. Dr. Xanther floated to the center of the hall, their geometric shapes expanding to catch everyone's attention. The purpose of this summit was not to determine a winner, but to understand different cognitive approaches. And what we have learned today is extraordinary. The displays around the hall lit up with brain scans, processing diagrams, and analysis charts. Talo represents systematic logical analysis, slow, methodical, perfect. And the Venn approach yields complete understanding, but requires significant time investment. Scifistory demonstrates empathic intuition. They sense solutions through emotional connection. And this works beautifully for artifacts designed by beings with similar emotional architectures. Kindar shows us distributed parallel processing, multiple minds examining multiple possibilities simultaneously. And this is powerful, but requires resources that most individual beings cannot access. Voronil exhibits temporal perception, seeing across timelines to find solutions that already exist elsewhere. And this is perhaps the most exotic approach, but demands abilities that few species possess. And then, Dr. Zenther's shape shifted to point at Kai. We have the human. The displays showed Kai's brain activity during his successful attempts. He uses heuristic processing combined with rapid trial and error. And he makes intuitive leaps based on pattern recognition that operates below conscious awareness. And yes, he fails more often than the others. But he also attempts solutions that none of them would try. Humans evolved to make fast decisions in chaotic environments, the doctor continued. And their cognition optimized for good enough answers arrived at quickly, with the understanding that wrong answers could be corrected if they survived the initial attempt. Taller stood, their crystalline structure rigid. Are you suggesting that guessing rapidly is equivalent to logical analysis? I am suggesting, Dr. Zenther replied carefully, that different problems require different approaches. And for challenges where time matters more than perfection, the human method has measurable advantages. The Director General raised one appendage for silence, the real. The precursor ship hung in space like a monument to forgotten ambitions. And it was massive beyond anything Kai had imagined. Kilometers of dark metal that seemed to drink in starlight rather than reflect it. And its surface was covered with the same flowing symbols that had adorned puzzle boxes. The expedition shuttle approached slowly, and Kai pressed his face to the viewport like a child visiting a museum for the first time. And beside him, Vrelanak made a sound that her translator rendered as reverent awe. In 800 years of galactic exploration, we have found perhaps 24 precursor structures, she said quietly. And her 4 arms were pressed against the viewport as well. And nothing remotely this size or this intact. Their team had been carefully selected Kai for his intuitive approach. Taller for logical analysis, Scifistory for empathic sensing, and Vrelanak as both expedition leader and systematic documentation specialist. And commanding them all was Captain Zorath, a Kryn warrior whose armored exoskeleton had seen combat in 3 different wars. Skyndar and Voronil had been assigned to other expedition teams because the Director General had decided to send multiple groups to explore different sections of the massive vessel simultaneously. And Kai suspected this was also a way to hedge their bets in case something went wrong. Previous expeditions penetrated 12% of smaller precursor sites, Zorath said, her voice carrying the clipped precision of military briefing. And we lost 17 personnel in those attempts. And the causes range from automated defenses to environmental hazards to simple structural collapse. Encouraging, Kai muttered. And Vrelanak's closest hand reached over to pat his shoulder with surprising gentleness. You will be fine, she said. And her skin color had shifted to a warm orange that suggested confidence. You have already demonstrated abilities that none of us fully understand. And besides, I did not spend 300 years teaching just to watch a promising student die on his first real expedition. The shuttle docked at what their scans suggested was an access port, though it looked more like a wound in the ship's hull that had been sealed with crystallized metal. And when Taller ran their analysis, they announced that the seal was intentional rather than damage. It is a lock, the Ven said, and their facets caught the shuttle's interior lights, and a sophisticated one. And I estimate it will take approximately 6 hours to calculate the proper opening sequence. Or, Kai said, already moving toward the airlock with his equipment harness. I could just try feeling it out. Zorath's armored head swiveled toward him. If you trigger a defense mechanism, you could kill us all. True, Kai admitted. But if Taller's calculations are wrong by even a small amount, the same thing could happen, and besides, the precursors seem to design their locks to be opened, not to be fortress-grade security. Relanac considered this, and her skin color shifted through several shades before settling on decisive green. Kai will attempt an intuitive approach while Taller simultaneously works on the mathematical solution. And if Kai succeeds, we save time, and if he fails without triggering defenses, we default to Taller's calculations. The compromise satisfied no one, but was accepted by everyone. And Kai suited up and cycled through the airlock to examine the seal up close in the vacuum of space. The precursor metal felt different through his suit's gloves. It vibrated at a frequency he could barely detect. And the symbols seemed to shift and flow even though he knew that was impossible without an active power source. He placed both hands on the seal surface and closed his eyes, trying to sense whatever pattern the precursors had built into this lock. And at first there was nothing. Just cold metal and the sound of his own breathing inside the helmet. But then, slowly, he began to feel it not with his hands, but with something deeper. Some part of his brain that specialized in finding patterns in chaos. And it was like listening to a conversation in a language he'd never learned, but somehow understood anyway. His hands moved, pressing symbols in a sequence that made no logical sense, but felt absolutely right. And the seal began to warm under his touch. Kai, your biosigns are spiking. Vrelinak's voice came through his helmet cum. And your heart rate is elevated, and are you all right? I'm fine, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. And I think it's responding. The seal split down the middle with a sound that carried even through vacuuma. Deep thrumming that Kai felt in his bones, and light spilled out from within the ship. Golden and warm, and completely wrong for a vessel that had been dead for 100,000 years. I am reading active power sources inside, Tala reported, their voice tight with what might have been excitement or fear. And environmental systems are initializing. And this ship is not as dead as we assumed. The team cycled through the airlock together, and Kai removed his helmet as sensors confirmed breathable atmosphere. And the air tasted of metals he couldn't identify, and something organic that reminded him of libraries or museums, the smell of old things carefully preserved. The corridor beyond the airlock stretched into darkness that their lights couldn't quite penetrate, and the walls were covered with more of those flowing symbols, and some of them were beginning to glow as if recognizing the presence of visitors. Stay together, Zorath commanded, and her weapon systems hummed to active status. And proceed with extreme caution. They advanced through corridors that seemed designed for beings roughly humanoid in proportion, and Kai found himself wondering if the precursors had looked like him, like Relanak, or like something entirely different that happened to use similar architectural preferences. The first chamber they encountered was sealed with a lock similar to the external one, but simpler, and Taller opened it in 40 minutes using geometric analysis. The second chamber responded to Sesheri's empathic approach, the lock releasing when the chlorin projected feelings of peaceful curiosity. The third chamber required Zorath's tactical thinking. It was a combat puzzle that tested strategy rather than empathy or mathematics, and the fourth chamber made all of them stop and stare. It was chaos incarnate, symbols that contradicted themselves, mechanisms that moved in impossible ways, surfaces that seemed to phase between solid and liquid. And Taller's scanning equipment simply gave error messages because the data made no mathematical sense. This is not solvable, the Ven announced. And their crystalline structure had gone dark with frustration, and the patterns are random. and random systems cannot be systematically analyzed. Kai approached the chamber's entrance, and that same intuitive sense that had opened the puzzle box in the classroom was screaming at him that this was important, that this was the real test. What if random is the pattern? He suggested, and he didn't wait for permission before pressing his hands to the door. The mechanisms responded instantly, and Kai found himself moving faster than he'd ever moved before, pressing and twisting and sliding components that appeared and disappeared. And his conscious mind had no idea what his hands were doing, but his subconscious seemed to be having a conversation with the door itself. 17 minutes later, the chamber opened. Impossible, Thaler said for perhaps the 10th time since meeting Kai inside the chamber, was an archive terminal. And when Vrelanak activated it with careful touches, holographic displays filled the air around them, showing images of beings that looked remarkably humanoid: 2 arms, 2 legs, heads with forward-facing eyes, the precursors, Sesheri whispered. And their gelatinous form had gone perfectly still. The archive began to play. And though the language was nothing Kai had ever heard, his translator implant worked frantically to render meaning. We were explorers, innovators, risk-takers who leaped before we calculated. And we rose to dominate the galaxy through adaptation and rapid iteration. More images showed precursor civilization at its height, cities that sprawled across continents, ships that crossed between galaxies, technology that bent the laws of physics like clay. We created these puzzles as a test, the recording continued. And we scattered them across space to find species who thought as we did, who understood that sometimes intuition matters more than analysis, that sometimes you must act before you have complete information. Kai felt a chill run down his spine because he was listening to the voice of beings who had died millennia before humans had even discovered fire. And yet they were describing the way he thought, the way he approached problems. The recording shifted, showing darker images: precursor cities going dark, ships drifting powerless, a civilization in collapse. But we failed to understand that intuition alone is not enough. And when we encountered the entropy barrier, a phenomenon that required patient, systematic analysis to overcome, we could not slow down. We could not be methodical. We had evolved past the ability to think in those terms. We tried to leap across the barrier as we had leaped across every other challenge, the voice said. And now it carried a weight of terrible sorrow. And we fell. The images showed the final days of precursor civilization. And Kai watched beings like himself die because they couldn't stop being what they were, couldn't adapt their thinking to match a problem that demanded patience instead of innovation. Let this be our warning and our gift, the recording concluded. And strength becomes weakness when it is the only tool you possess, and the mechanism dominated the chamber's center. And it was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a construction of metal and light, and something that might have been solidified time itself. And its components moved in patterns that suggested purpose without revealing function. Kai circled it slowly while the countdown timer projected on the wall showed 5 hours and 43 minutes remaining. And his intuition was screaming that this was solvable, but not by him alone. And maybe that was the whole point. We need to approach this systematically, Vrelanak said. And her 4 arms were already deploying recording equipment. And Thaler, I need you to map the mathematical relationships between the visible components. Already in progress, the Ven replied. And their scanning beams painted the mechanism with geometric analysis. And I am detecting 73 distinct subsystems, each with internal logic. But the connections between subsystems appear random. They are not random, Kai said. And he was running his hands along one section of the mechanism without quite touching it. They feel intentional. But the intention is pattern-based rather than rule-based. Sesheri had extended pseudopods to touch various components, and their form was cycling through colors that indicated intense concentration, I sense different emotional signatures in different sections. And some parts feel welcoming while others feel defensive. And there is a rhythm to it like a heartbeat. Zorath had taken a position where she could see all her teammates and the mechanisms simultaneously. This is like coordinating a combat operation with multiple units. And each of you represents different capabilities. And my job is timing and integration. The first hour was spent in exploration and documentation. And Taller created a detailed map of the mechanisms' physical structure, while Sesheri charted its emotional landscape, and K identified sections that his intuition recognized as important. Relic synthesized all their findings into a working theory. The mechanism has 5 primary sections that must be activated in sequence. But each section requires a different cognitive approach. And we cannot activate the next section until the previous one stabilizes. How do we know the correct sequence? Kai asked. We do not, Taller admitted, and their crystalline structure dimmed with uncertainty. And there are 120 possible sequences for 5 sections. And we do not have time to test them all. Zoreth stepped forward, her military experience suddenly relevant. In combat, when you do not know the enemy's plan, you force them to reveal it through probing actions. And this mechanism is our opponent. And we need to make it show us what it wants. She pointed at Kai. You will attempt to activate what your intuition says is the first section. And when you do, the mechanism will respond in some way. And that response will give Taller data for analysis. And Sesheri will sense the emotional reaction. And we will learn from the attempt, even if it fails. It was risky, but logical. And Kai approached the section that felt most ready, a spiral of silver metal that seemed to pulse with barely contained energy. His hands moved across its surface, finding hidden switches and pressure points. And the spiral began to rotate, faster and faster, until it locked into place with a sound like a bell being struck immediately. 3 other sections of the mechanism lit up with golden light. It is showing us the next possible choices, Ralanak said, her voice tight with excitement, and the mechanism is responding to correct inputs by revealing more of itself. Taller moved to the 3 lit sections, analyzing each with frantic speed. This one requires geometric precision. This one needs empathic resonance. And this one is chaotic and will require intuitive problem solving. But which order? Sesheri asked Kai, closed his eyes and tried to sense the right answer. But for once, his intuition gave him nothing clear. Just a vague feeling that all 3 were important. Sarath made the command decision. Taller, you take the geometric section because precision is your strength. And Sesheri will handle empathic resonance simultaneously. And Kai will stand ready for the chaotic section when the others succeed. Simultaneously? Taller questioned. And that is not how systematic problem-solving works. No, Zoreth agreed. But this is not a systematic problem, and I believe the mechanism requires coordination rather than sequence. And we move together, or we fail together. At her signal, Taller and Sesheri began working on their respective sections. And Kai watched the chaotic component carefully, waiting for the moment it would be ready. Taller's approach was poetry and precision. They calculated angles and ratios, applied force at exact points, rotated components through mathematically perfect arcs. And their section began to glow with blue light. Sesheri pressed their entire form against their section, and they projected waves of curiosity, welcome, and understanding. And their section responded by opening like a flower, revealing mechanisms within mechanisms, and the chaotic section suddenly erupted with activity. Panels sliding and mechanisms whirring, and Kai dove in without hesitation, his hands moving in patterns that looked random but felt absolutely necessary. The 3 sections locked into place simultaneously, and the entire mechanism shuddered and lifted 0.5 meter off the floor before settling back down with new components now visible. 2 sections remain, Relinak announced. And the timer showed 3 hours and 17 minutes. And they are both more complex than what we have already solved. One section was clearly strategic. It resembled a 3-dimensional tactical board with moving pieces that represented unknown variables. The other section was something beyond their experience. And it seemed to exist partially out of phase with normal space. And components appeared and disappeared, as if cycling through multiple realities. "The tactical section is mine," Zorath said, and she was already analyzing the board. "But the phase-shifted section requires abilities none of us possess. Temporal manipulation," Thaler said quietly. "And we need Vornal for this, but they are exploring a different section of the ship." Kai stared at the impossible section, and a crazy idea formed. What if we do not need to solve it the way it was designed? And what if we can use our combined approaches to simulate temporal perception? "Explain," Relinak demanded. "You document everything systematically," Kai said, speaking quickly as the idea crystallized. "And Thaler can calculate probability matrices for different states of the mechanism. And Sesheri can sense which states feel correct. And I can make intuitive leaps between the states we identify. And together we create a kind of temporal map, even though none of us can actually perceive time like Vornal does." It was insane and brilliant, and possibly the only option they had. And Relinak's skin color shifted through a dozen shades before settling on determined orange. "Do it. And Zorath, solve your section as quickly as possible. And we will need the mechanism's full cooperation for the final phase." The next 2 hours were the most intense of Kai's life. And Zorath played the tactical board like a chess master, moving pieces in patterns that gradually revealed the section's underlying logic. Meanwhile, Kai and the others attempted something that should have been impossible. Relinak documented every state change in the phase-shifted section. Thaler calculated probabilities for each configuration. Sesheri sensed the emotional rightness of different possibilities. And Kai made intuitive connections between states that logic alone would never have linked. It was messy and imperfect, and they failed dozens of times. But slowly, agonizingly, they began to understand the phase-shifted section's pattern with 47 minutes remaining. Zorath's tactical board locked into its final configuration with 19 minutes remaining. The team's collective approach to the phase-shifted section finally yielded results. And Kai's hands were bleeding from touching components that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. But the section activated, the mechanism came fully alive. And every component was now glowing, rotating, harmonizing in ways that suggested purpose and meaning. A voice spoke not through their translators, but directly into their minds, and it was the same voice from the archive recording. "Well done. And you have demonstrated what we could not, the ability to think together while thinking differently. And you have earned the legacy we leave behind." Light poured from the mechanism and coalesced into data streams that their recording equipment automatically captured, terabytes of information containing precursor science, technology, philosophy, and history. "But remember our warning," the voice continued. "And do not let any single approach to intelligence dominate. And do not become what we became, so specialized in one method of thought that you cannot adapt to challenges requiring others." The mechanism slowly powered down, its purpose fulfilled, and the team stood in exhausted silence. Relin checked her data. "We have it all. And this information will advance galactic civilization by centuries, possibly millennia, if we use it wisely," Kai added. And he was thinking about the Precursor's fall, about how their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness 6 months later. Kai stood at the front of a classroom at the Galactic Coordination Academy, and the room was filled with students from 24 species. And he held a puzzle box in his hands. "This semester," he said, and his voice was steady despite his nerves about teaching, You will learn that there is no single correct way to solve problems.